So, Patrick, Nate, first half hour here, we're going to talk UFC 287. This is Pereira versus Adesanya 2. We're going to get to that fight in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about the fight on the undercard, not Pereira versus Adesanya, not Burns versus Masvidal, which we're going to talk about. I'm really excited about the Masvidal fight. But any other fight that you might be interested in for UFC 287 that looks really appealing. Patrick, I'd like to start with you. What's a fight you're locked into here for UFC 287?
I got to tell you, I looked at some of the other fights, and to tell you the God's honest truth, I'm really not interested as much as I am in the Burns Masvidal fight. And I know you wanted something else, but I just think that fight is going to be the absolute best fight of the night. You're going to have two guys, and not going too far into it because we're going to diagnose that fight, but two guys who love to fight. They're not fighting for a title. And in my opinion, when you have guys that are not fighting for a title, they're fighting to win. When you start getting the title into things and the politics and the background stories and all this stuff, I start to think guys fight not to lose. And they're not nearly as exciting as they are with two guys who just want to rip each other's heads off.
Yeah, and we'll get to the Masvidal fight in a minute because that is something that's really interesting. And when I was putting this schedule together, I thought, maybe we should just spend 15 minutes on Burns Masvidal because it's such an interesting fight in the fact that it's not a main event, but both of those are really amazing fighters. So Nate, why don't you very quickly then give us the fight from a betting perspective that you might be really interested in here. And then we'll just move to Burns and Masvidal and have a more robust discussion about that fight.
So we're talking about the fight that I'm excited about.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I've kind of been staring hard at this Rob Font, Adrian Yanez fight just because it looks like a lot of action. Rob Font is a guy who looks to throw a lot of punches. I'm looking at his last couple of fights against Jose Aldo and Chito Vera, and he outlanded them by like a ton of punches and still lost almost every round he fought. Which makes for some pretty fun stuff because in every round he got like just tagged by somebody really hard that put him on his ass or put him on his butt or something else. So just from just sort of like just watching guys just stand there and just bang, I sort of like that. Just because Rob Font is so prolific. And then we have Yanez, who's also, a really good sort of boxer in his own right. So if I'm just looking at fights that I kind of like, I think that's probably it. I think that there's probably a little bit of value in Font just because, at some point he's got to like win some rounds that he just outlands everybody all the time. So that's sort of what I'm looking at and what I'm excited about. He's a slight underdog right now. He's plus 155. So go out there and after a long layoff and see if he can do something. That's sort of the fight that I'm interested in as Rob Font as a small underdog.
So Rob Font, interesting. Do you know the odds on that?
He's plus 155 right now.
Okay, plus 155. So that's interesting. I've got one as well that we can do really quickly. Then we'll get to the Masvidal fight. I like the Gerald Meeschart, Joe Pyfer fight and this is another betting reason here. So Meeschart, if you look at him, he's not the greatest fighter in the world. He's got 14 or 15 losses, I believe. He can be slow and plodding. He spends a lot of time backing up and trying to play defense. But here's what I like about him. His last 4 fights as an underdog, he's won. So from a betting perspective, he's absolute money as an underdog. Like we talk about all the time during the NFL season, don't ever bet against Mike Tomlin as an underdog. Don't ever take Mike Vrabel as an underdog. I think this is another situation. Gerald Meeschart, 35-15 against the up-and-comer Joe Pyfer, 10-2. If you're just wanting to play a trend here, I think we can play the trend and take Meeschart at plus 165. However, I mean, I've watched him fight before, and there's nothing super impressive. Pyfer is probably a better fighter and should be favored, but just based on the things I kind of like Meeschart there. So 2 fights that we're pretty excited about for UFC 287, especially from a betting perspective. Now, Patrick, I'll let you open here. Gilbert Burns versus Jorge Masvidal. What do you see in this fight? Burns is 21-5, Masvidal 35-16. Should be an interesting bout. What do you like in this fight?
I think it's going to be a great fight. And before I go into that fight, Meerschaert has 35 wins. So you can't discount that. That's a lot of experience. A record very, very similar to Jorge Masvidal. Now, I've known of Masvidal ever since he was a teenager, fighting at the American Top Team when I was in the midst of my career and he was starting out. So he's been fighting professional MMA since he's been 18 years old at one of the best teams at that time and now on the planet, the American Top Team. There's a lot of discussion about how great Gilbert Burns is on the ground. And yeah, he really, really is. But you've also got to understand that Masvidal has been training with the best of the best ever since he's been a teenager as well. So I'm looking at that as sort of a wash. On a betting perspective, Nate, I would probably look to see what the odds are of Burns losing by submission or Masvidal winning by submission, and that's probably the best bet. But I'm sure that it's just insanely expensive.
Masvidal to win by decision. Submission. He's a plus 2,800, so 28-1 to win by submission.
And Burns to lose by submission.
Well, that would be the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. So that's probably way out of sorts to bet that, but I think those are probably going to be the least likely outcome of the two. I would say that Burns is a really good striker, has improved his striking. I just hope that he doesn't start to think that he's a better striker than he is an all-around fighter. I think Burns, his real value in this fight is in being an all-around fighter, mixing it up, using his jiu-jitsu. The problem here is that Masvidal has phenomenal takedown defense, and he hits really hard. So you're sort of canceling out each other's strong points, and I don't see how one guy is really going to force his will upon the other. I just see this pretty much being a slugfest, which is something that I would love to see. I don't see a whole lot of technical groundwork going on. Masvidal can absolutely be as technical as you want him to be. He sort of kind of follows the way that I used to fight, that sort of doctrine of, if we're on the ground and I'm on top, I'd rather hit you than try to go for a submission. So I really respect that. I love that. But Burns is crafty. He's strong, and he's technically phenomenal on the ground. So that's my view of the fight.
Patrick, can you say more about what you mean by Burns being technically phenomenal?
He's got a lot more tournament jiu-jitsu, no-gi jiu-jitsu experience, just grappling. And that has a lot of weight. It carries a lot of weight, especially when you start getting into the MMA world, which Burns has been in for many, many years, and you can incorporate the two and flow in and out of one another, which would give him, in my opinion, a better chance at catching some kind of submission in a scramble on the ground, more so than Masvidal, because Masvidal is straight up MMA. I have not heard of him doing a whole lot of tournament jiu-jitsu, a lot of no-gi jiu-jitsu. He's just focused straight on the fighting part, which that's a tough nut to crack when that's all you do and you've got an answer for everything.
Okay, so Nate, what do you see here from a betting perspective, or just from your own perspective, Burns versus Masvidal?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of interesting from a betting perspective, right? And especially when you get these sort of inflated lines. I mean, Burns is such a huge favorite that you sort of have to dig around to find any value anywhere. So that's sort of what I've been doing, is trying to figure out how to break this down. Just because Burns is somewhere around a minus 460 favorite, and Masvidal is somewhere around plus 350, depending on where you get it. It's minus 435, plus 350 right now for those two. But if you start looking at winning method, Patrick sort of already previewed that a little bit. I think maybe you could find some value. According to the odds, the most likely outcome is Gilbert Burns to win by decision. He's plus 175 to win by decision. I think if you're going to bet it, I think that probably has to be the way to do it. I mean, nobody's going to doubt sort of Masvidal's toughness. He did get knocked out against Usman, and Colby Covington got pretty close, but didn't get there. He didn't finish him. So I think if you're just looking at it from a betting perspective, it's probably Burns to win by decision. I know that Masvidal's been so entertaining in the press conferences with all the posturing, and, people are asking him, your betting line's so high, and he's telling everybody to bet the house on it. He's going to make everybody rich in Vegas, blah, blah, blah. I just don't see it, though. I mean, as much as we might, love Masvidal as a fighter, love him as a personality, love him as the king of South Florida, I don't know. He's also 38 years old, and the chin seems to be starting to show some wear and tear after all these fights and just sort of the accumulated damage of a 20-year career. So I worry about him. The Covington fight, he didn't look awesome. He kind of, let himself get taken down probably more than he should have, and sort of let Colby Covington control that fight a little bit too much. So if I'm looking at this, I like Burns. I don't love laying that much juice on this. I don't want to lay minus 435 on him, but I think, throwing down a play on by decision is probably the smart play.
So, okay. So by decision, that's pretty interesting there. Patrick, any concern about Masvidal's age? We've talked about that before, and it seems like you, and when Wagner's on here, Wagner's don't seem as concerned about age as maybe some of the punditry.
Well, yeah, because as far as I'm concerned, if he had taken an enormous amount of damage and just keeps getting knocked out fight after fight after fight, I would have some concern. But he's not. And, everybody's got their issues before they come into a fight. You have no idea what's going on in their lives. There's all kinds of rumors about what was going on in Masvidal's life before he fought Covington. And if you're not focused completely on a fight, it can definitely hurt you. Like if you go back to the Chuck Liddell years where he was just dominating people, standing up for years, and then he started to get tagged, you could now see that it was taking a serious effect on his career, because anybody would throw a flick out and you were worried he was going to get knocked out after that time. I don't see Masvidal in that same category.
Okay, interesting. Nate, you got any other thoughts?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that I'm always the one that's like worried about like older fighters. So I mean, I must be part of the
maybe it's just you.
Maybe it's just me. I'm always worried. I'm like, oh, after that first knockout, they're never going to be the same. So maybe that's probably just me.
Well, we have talked about how the knockouts, the first time you get a knockout, maybe you're a little bit more cautious. But, again, I mean, Patrick.
And this goes directly to Nate's point. When I started fighting about 150 years ago, my first dozen or so fights were victories by submission, because I was a wrestler. I would take people down, I'd grind them out, and I'd beat on them or I'd submit them. Finally, I got knocked out cold, because in all honesty, my stand-up was not that great at that point. I didn't even know what happened. I woke up and I realized, wow, that's the worst thing that's going to happen. So what did I do? I trained stand-up with the best, biggest, most brutal guys for the next 2 years that I could find, didn't take a fight. And now I'd rather stand up and bang with people. So it has a different effect on people.
Different mentality, I guess. Okay. So before we get into the Pereira Adesanya fight, and I'm really excited to talk about this, I wanted to leave as much time as possible. But let's talk first about one of our newest sponsors, Birch Gold. Birch Gold is inflation has consequences. As the Fed raises interest rates to combat out of control government spending, long-term bonds have diminished in value, crippling banks. Depositors are holding their breath and investors are bailing on bank stocks. Diversification has never been more important. The recent surge in gold prices is directly tied to the extreme market volatility right now. This is why gold has historically been a great hedge against the stock market and against inflation. Now would be a great time to diversify into gold with the Birch Gold Group. Birch Gold makes it easy to convert an IRA or 401k into an IRA in precious metals. Here's what you need to do. Text Godzilla, that's Godzilla, to 989898 to get a free info kit on gold. Again, that's Godzilla to 989898. They'll help you convert your existing IRA and 401k that's tied to a volatile market into an IRA in physical precious metals, gold and silver. And the best part, it's tax sheltered. Text Godzilla to 989898 to claim your free info kit on gold today with an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. Thousands of happy customers and countless 5-star reviews. Birch Gold is who you can trust to protect your future. Text Godzilla 989898. We want to thank Birch Gold for partnering with us to make everything we do here possible. Okay, this leaves us about 12 minutes, y'all, for Pereira versus Adesanya, and I've been thinking about this fight a lot. So let's start, as always, with our fight guy, Patrick. What do you see here for the second bout but in the UFC for these two, even though I think they fought 4 times because they fought a couple times in tournament kickboxing. So these two are familiar foes, really kind of an interesting matchup here. Adesanya going for the belt. And I believe Adesanya is a favorite as well. So Patrick, let's start with you.
Well, there's also a little bit of controversy here. There, Adesanya's camp, and I love Adesanya. I love the guy. I think he's phenomenal. He's a great personality. He's a great character. He's a stand-up guy from everything I've ever seen. They're accusing Pereira about after a weigh-in blowing himself up with IVs. You know something? If somebody wants to do that, that's fine. The second time I fought for the world championship, I fought a guy who usually fought at 205 pounds, came down to 170. He looked like death, dehydrating. There were rumors that he was shooting up with IVs that night. What I can tell you is this: it doesn't make you Superman overnight, if that's even what Pereira is doing. Okay. I've been in the hospital twice, almost died from dehydration 2 times. I can tell you, you are not doing backflips and throwing cartwheels out the next day. It doesn't happen that way. Pereira is huge. He is a very large man. He dehydrated down. You could see it in the last fight. So he still had the power to knock Adesanya out in the final round, though. So you can never discount the guy's power. You cannot discount his drive or his motivation. Adesanya, the last fight, he was winning 4 out of 5 rounds. Right. Then he lost. Okay. I think if you try the same thing over and over and over again and continue to fail, that's the definition of insanity. I think the keys to Adesanya winning this fight are mixing it up, taking him down, letting him up. If Pereira is truly that dehydrated and cutting that much weight, which you could see him slow down in the last fight, the key to destroying somebody like that is taking him down, letting him up, taking him down, letting him up, taking him down, riding him, riding him, riding him. I don't see Adesanya being in a whole lot of trouble on the ground. I don't think that, and I could be wrong, that maybe Pereira's takedown defense and his ability to get up and wrestle up off the ground has gotten much, much better in a few months. I don't know. I think Adesanya, for being in MMA as long as he has, should have a much better ground game. Maybe he's choosing not to use it. But I think if he wants to win this fight, he needs to employ that. And he needs to burn Pereira out. I think if they stand up, it's a puncher's chance. They can knock each other out. Why would you really want to do that if that's what happened last time? And you've lost to him before kickboxing. Take that out of the equation, and I think Adesanya has a much, much better chance of winning this fight.
Can Adesanya win by submission, or is this going to be something where he needs to get it to a decision by getting on the ground a bunch? And let's just stop there.
I don't see Adesanya winning by submission. He had Pereira in some pretty horrible spots in their first fight and didn't even really try a submission. I was shocked to hell that Pereira rolled an escape, went for a leg lock on Adesanya, but he didn't really try to bite down on it and get it. I don't know if he's technically proficient enough to get it at that level. but he tried more submissions than Adesanya did. I think when you've got guys that are this far along in their career and do things their way, they're not going to make these gigantic tactical changes. Strategically, you might be able to make a difference, but tactically, when you're in the middle of the fight and survival mode kicks in, you're either going for submissions or you're not. I don't see Adesanya turning into a submission machine over the last few months, but he can definitely take him down. He can control him on the ground. And I think he should he should deal out a lot more damage in those kinds of positions if he can, because when they're on the ground, the biggest problem Adesanya has is taken away because Pereira's not striking. He's trying to get away.
Yeah, and so Pereira has those heavy hands and is proficient at the knockouts. Nate, what do you see in this fight here, either from a betting perspective or just from the punditry, as you are? What do you like in the Pereira Adesanya 2?
My initial inclination is that I kind of lean towards the underdog. So the line right now is Pereira plus 120, Adesanya minus $140. So, the market seems to give the slight nod to Israel Adesanya, but not by much, right? And I think that this fight just feels really coin flippy to me, much like a lot of their other fights have been. They sort of trade results. Both of them are live, and it feels like Pereira sort of figured out how to solve the puzzle of Adesanya, which nobody else in the UFC has really done a very effective job at, right? And I think that it's sort of disrespectful to make him an underdog after beating him, although he was down on the cards, he did land that TKO at the end in the 5th round. So my sort of initial reaction is Pereira. I think that, he brings so much volume and pace to this fight. He'll probably try and push Adesanya. Typically, the optics of that look good if he can, land some punches. Adesanya seemed to struggle with the leg kicks in their last fight, which slowed him down a little bit. And it seemed like the knock on Adesanya was when does he fight someone that's his size in middleweight, right? Because he's gigantic, 6'4". And then he finally fought somebody who was his size at middleweight, and they beat him.
And
so
bigger.
Yeah, and bigger than him. Not even what's gonna happen when Adesanya isn't towering over his opponent. It's what happens when he fights someone that's his own size, or in Pereira's case, it's actually bigger and doesn't have this huge reach advantage that he enjoyed for a lot of his earlier fights. So my sort of lean is towards Pereira as an underdog. Even though it'd be fun to to set up a trilogy fight, I guess, where they fight each other for the 170th time in their career, between kickboxing and MMA.
Could be fun. So, Patrick, I want to ask you 2 questions. The first has to do, so Trent Connor is one of our writers at Godzilla Wins. He does a lot of the prop bets for us for UFCs, very proficient in this stuff. And one of the things that he is suggesting you might consider as a bettor is the under 2.5 total rounds at plus 165. And here's why he thinks that. He thinks that because these two have fought each other so often, there's no feeling, they don't have to feel each other out. So they can just immediately attack because they both kind of know how to fight each other. From a fighter's perspective, is that something that's true? If you fought someone a couple times, do you just go right after them, or is there still that sort of tenuous kind of first round, second round, I got to feel this guy out, I got to get my feet under me?
Well, it's what I had said earlier about them, particularly Adesanya, just changing his style in the next fight. He's been fighting this way for years. People just, in my opinion, just don't change. That's just the way that they are. Can they make some tactical alterations to their game? Sure they can. Because if you work on it, for 4, 5, 6 months, it's going to start easing into your game. But I don't think that huge differences are going to be made. If these guys are still feeling each other out because they know each other's power, this is not like a K1 fight or a 1FC fight where you got 3 rounds of 3 minutes. You're just going to bang. You have no time. This is a 5-minute round fight. They've got time, and they pretty much take it to the end of every fight they've ever been in.
Yeah, that's kind of my thinking. I love Trent's analysis, but I think it's a little bit of a stretch to think that they're just going to attack each other. And then, of course, in order for Adesanya to win, he probably needs to take it to decision.
And with that being said, Jack, with that being said, would it be in one of their best interests to do exactly what Trent thinks? Absolutely. Just throw a wrench in the works and come out completely unpredictable, doing something you've never done before. And that could absolutely screw up the other guy.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be an interesting strategy. So, Patrick, I want to ask you one more thing, because this is something that I'm going to admit my own ignorance with the UFC a little bit here. Something that I always see around this time, Friday, after weigh-in, right before the fights, is the IV issues. And I don't understand enough about the IV as far as the rules that the UFC has in place for the IV. I suppose I understand the advantage is just getting yourself hydrated and putting on, some extra weight after you've weighed in. But you mentioned the controversy about the IV earlier. Can you sort of take us through, for some of the listeners who don't watch a lot of UFC, why the IVs are such a big issue in the sport?
Well, because theoretically what happens is you dehydrate yourself to such a degree to make a weight that you are absolutely bone dry. And just make the comparison to a car. What happens when oil runs out of your engine? The engine seizes, it breaks up, and you've got thousands and thousands of dollars of repair, or you have a junk car. That's it. The same thing happens to your body. If you've never had dehydration to the point to where you are urinating brown, when your body is about to shut down and you are within hours of dying, you have no idea. I'm not saying that Pereira is that close, but to drop as much weight as he did to get to this weight class, it takes an enormous weight cut, especially the most amount of it comes in the last 24 hours. So what's the thinking here? The thinking here is you come in, you make weight, you go back to your hotel room, you stick the IVs in, you blow up again. Well, as much as it took out of you to lose that weight, it's as much of a shock to your body to put that much liquid back in that kind of time. So are you Superman for the first round? Sure. Like when I was saying earlier, the second time that I fought for the WEF World Championship, that was the similar situation. The guy I was fighting was really, really strong in the first round and a half. And then after that, it was as if he disappeared. And is it healthy? No, it's not healthy. Is it a choice? Sure, it's a choice. If you're asking me, I would start my weight cut a little bit earlier. I would not go nearly as high in the off season between fights. I very rarely lost more than 15 pounds for a fight. And probably the last 5-6 pounds would be the last week. I was already down. I was fine. I was healthy. I never had anything to worry about. I've been weight cutting since I was 11 years old. So to me, It was just part of the gig.
That's really interesting. As someone who has drank like 2 water bottles too quickly and then like had to take a nap, I can't imagine just slamming a bunch of water in an IV and then walking out there for the biggest fight of your life and feeling like, oh, I'm locked in. But I'm not built like these UFC fighters. It's just sort of interesting because you hear it all the time, and I'll see on Twitter the other fighter will be like, oh, here he comes with the IV, like just ridiculous nonsense. Here we go. And so, yeah.
Just a comment before we go. You have a bunch of these keyboard warriors who've never been in a fight in their lives. They've never been backstage. They have no idea what it's like. Let me tell you something. Oh, he has absolutely no proof. And I'm not saying that he does or he doesn't. People talk when you're there. They're all a bunch of little gossips, and maybe a lot of them, and I've been guilty of doing this myself. I've purposely put out bad information and misinformation to make people think that I were injured or there was something wrong. So that's mostly part of the head game.
Interesting. So let's get to the picks then. Nate, Pereira, Adesanya. Who you got?
I like Pereira plus 120.
Okay. Patrick, Pereira, Adesanya.
If Izzy changes his game up and he takes him down and beats him up and keeps him there and wants to win the fight, not try to knock him out, I go with Izzy.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the favorite as well, Adesanya. I just think that most of the time, Adesanya is winning the fights. And if you keep fighting like this, at some point, you're going to break through and you're going to win. And then I hope we have a trilogy. So I'm also rooting for that. Okay. So that's our UFC 287 coverage. We covered Gilbert Burns versus Jorge Masvidal, Pereira versus Adesanya, the second UFC fight, and some fights that we are very interested in. Should be a lot of fun on Saturday night for UFC 287 in Miami, an electric atmosphere as always.